NATO countries, including Canada, have just announced a staggering defense spending plan. My message to you is don't worry. I'll explain why in this video. I'm Steve Sanford, you're watching Dominion Report. Now you're going to hear the legacy media throw all kinds of huge numbers at you, and the numbers are huge. So we're going to cover the basics, and then I'm going to tell you why, despite the huge numbers, this is probably something that you shouldn't be losing sleep over. Now, I don't do fancy charts and graphs on this channel. I don't actually even do any editing. I just talk and upload. So there's a bunch of numbers and math that I'm going to talk about, but I'll put some of them into the description, the video description below. So this plan, and in fact, it includes all but one NATO member country. The plan calls for 5% of GDP to be spent on national security and defense. The budget for this will be $150 billion for Canada alone. Now, if you've already done some basic math on this, you'll know that Canada's GDP was roughly $2.25 trillion last year, and 5% of that would be $112 billion, not $150. However, the plan calls for the 5% to be achieved by 2035. So that probably fits with expected GDP growth to about $3 trillion by 2035, which make $150 billion fit with the stated 5%. NATO has historically targeted only 2% of GDP as the amount that member countries should spend. Canada has often missed that mark. In fact, last year we spent about 1.37%, about $41 billion on defense. Not too long ago, Carney had already committed to increase that to 2%, which would have updated the $41 billion to about $61 billion. However, this announcement ups that to $150 billion. Now, so far we've been talking about the numbers as a percentage of GDP, but as we all know, GDP is not the same as the federal budget. So if we look at them against the federal budget, they actually look even a little bit more daunting. Canada's federal budget last year was $538 billion. Our $41 billion defense spend was about 7.5% of that. If we increase that to $150 billion, it goes from 7.5% to 27% of our national budget. I'm going to say it again, these numbers are huge. You don't just transfer almost 20% of the federal budget to defense without cutting those funds from somewhere else. And these are conclusions that you may have heard from the legacy media. They love to make you afraid for clicks. And I guess I'm hoping that I can alleviate some of that anxiety, also for clicks, which I appreciate. Before we get to that, feel free to pause this video and put a comment below and tell me what you've heard from the legacy media on this topic. Now, okay, I promised I would explain. You shouldn't be too concerned, and there's a number of reasons why. First, we can take a look at the numbers over time. So let's make the assumption with the federal budget in terms of between now and 2035 that we already made about the GDP. I've done the math on that. If the federal budget grows at the same as what we talked about with GDP, instead of 27%, the defense spend comes out to 20% of our national budget. Now that's still a lot, but not as much as it was. Next, I want to talk about what's actually being defined as security and defense. Already, since the announcement, we've been told that about 1/5 of the budget, so about 1.5 of those 5%, is for security-related infrastructure. So if you have armies and you have military aircraft and military ships, you need supplies, you need fuel, you need food for all of your personnel, and you need weapons, and you need to transport those things and those personnel all around the country. So a big chunk of infrastructure would be highways, roads, ports, airports, all that transportation infrastructure, and all that fits under 1.5% of the 5%. Of course, infrastructure like that is important to the function of a national military, but it's also used by everyday Canadians. It's used by Canadian businesses, and it's used to facilitate commerce, trade, and economic growth and prosperity. So we can call them part of national security, and we can use national security funds to upgrade those things, but they're certainly for more than just national security. And further on this, while we're talking about economic growth and stability, that in itself can be considered part of national security. You can't have a strong military if your country is destitute. So if we go back to our previous numbers, we went from 7.5% to 20% of our federal budget, and we take that portion out, that allocation toward infrastructure, it's now 7.5% to 17.5%. So already we have halved the amount of budget increase that some of the legacy media have been reporting on. Okay, here's another thing to discuss. Mark Carney has recently said that Canada should no longer send 3/4 of our defense capital spending to America. We need to diversify our defense procurement, and that means buying some items from perhaps European countries, but it could also mean developing industry to manufacture some of them right here in Canada. That would likely mean an investment by the federal government in defense manufacturing, and that would take advantage of Canadian natural resources so that we don't keep just pulling stuff out of the ground and then shipping it off to other countries to make things. We actually make something ourselves out of those resources. And we not only supply our military, but we can also sell those items to other countries. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to start manufacturing machine guns and tanks and shells to sell as weapons of war. There are thousands of non-weaponry related items that militaries need. And that can also be items that can also be used for non-military civilian purposes. So things like portable shelters and drones and vehicles and modular bridges and navigation equipment and body armor and MREs and water purification, and the list goes on and on and on. In fact, I would add solar and wind-powered renewable energy tech to that list. That can very much be considered military equipment, and it has tremendous civilian use and represents a growing technology sector that Canada is really lagging behind in. All of these are part of Canada's necessary withdrawal from a near exclusive partnership that we've had with the United States for many decades. And that's to become a more diversified worldwide trading economy. And that's something that, of course, I've talked about on this channel fairly often. So that sort of discussion can come out of the 3.5%. But it's a bit more vague and a little bit more speculative, so I can't really give you updated numbers more than I already have on that. There is actually another fairly significant talking point to make on this issue, but I'm going to put that into a separate video because it requires a bit of context, and it sort of fits in its own category. But I'm going to give you a hint. It's all about how the NATO member country leaders appear to be getting together and managing Donald Trump. Give me another day or so and I'll have that video ready for you. And be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss it.